All right, so part two. Hopefully by now you've gone through and you've watched Kumail Nanjiani's video, and now you're returning to go over our examples. So if you look at the McWhorter book, Reflections, page 184, she talks about the introduction to a narrative essay, and she says the introduction catches the reader's attention, provides background information, sets up sequence of events, and establishes a point of view, and usually contains the thesis. So your introduction does a lot of work in a narrative essay, and so this might feel a little overwhelming at first, so I wanted to talk about how Nanjiani actually does that in his setup. So he catches the reader's attention, I think, in this case by using two things, humor and relatability. So first of all, he wants you to laugh. He's very casual in his approach, and he immediately picks on himself. He tells you, there's a point in this story where you're going to feel sad for me. Don't feel sad for me. He's trying to joke around and show you that he wants you to be lighthearted. And in a more formal narrative, you wouldn't always speak to the audience the way that he does, but because he's in a very casual setting and he's speaking rather than writing, he actually addresses the audience and he sets up that humor. But you can use humor in your essay too. You might have to go about it differently than he does, but you could still use humor. And then relatability. So immediately he talks about how this story is about wanting to be cool. And I think that that's something a lot of people relate to. All I wanted to do was be cool. Even people who really are cool in school sometimes want to be even cooler, right? Wanting to fit in is a very relatable idea. And a lot of times in narratives, you can hook the audience in by talking to them about something that they can relate to. And later on, we're going to talk about stories that go the opposite way and hook you in by telling you something fascinating that you didn't know about. But right now, we're going to talk about how his hook is relatability. He wants you to see him as just a regular guy who has a story that might be kind of like something you've gone through before. And his thesis is fascinating. He sets it up just like a 5-paragraph thesis where he tells you the ways that he was planning to be cool. He actually lists them. He says, I was going to walk real slow. I was going to go, heh, whenever people said something funny, and then I was going to make fun of people, right? He sets up the ways that he's planning to be cool. So he kind of tells you, here's what you're going to see me do in this story. And I think it's just fascinating that he does that. And I also want you to note, if you go back and watch the video, you can tell from the beginning, this is not going to go well for him, right? He never says, things are going to get really bad for me. But you can tell from the way that he sets the story up that things are not likely to work out. And one of the ways you can tell that is because we've got experience with stories like this. He's relying on you to be familiar with the classic tale of the dorky kid who thinks he's going to be cool and then he's really not, right? He's counting on you to understand that eventually the conflict of this story is that he's going to want to try to be cool and it's not going to work out. He also has a very specific point of view. He's telling the story from the perspective of the new kid who just wants to be cool and fit in. And he sets himself up that way so that you understand that's whose eyes you're going to be seeing this story through, right? He's not telling you a story from the perspective of somebody who's always been cool and always been hip. He's the dorky kid who wants to fit in, and that's the point of view he's coming from. And he also sets up that it's a funny point of view by picking on himself from the very beginning and being kind of self-deprecating and saying, like, don't feel sorry for me, and also don't expect there to be any physical fighting in this story. The other thing that his introduction sets up is where the story takes place and when it takes place. We know he grew up in Pakistan, so you know it's not in the U.S., and it's at this new school, and he gives you a little bit of a sense of, he doesn't tell you exactly how old he was, right? He never says, I was 10 years old. You get the sense that he's probably a teenager, in part because they're kids driving later in the story, but also because it sounds like the kind of thing teenagers or middle schoolers care about, right? So he never tells you exactly how old he is. He just lets you get a sense of that. But you know generally where the story is taking place. So you know the details that are important for understanding him. As the plot unfolds, so in the body of the essay, the plot would unfold, and we're going to build up to the conflict. So he starts out with things moving pretty quickly. He finds out the hierarchy of the school and who the cool kids are, and he looks at these cool kids and he tries to compare them to his plan, right? And that's where you get that moment where he says, oh, I realized they make fun of each other, and that was my plan, was that I was going to insult people, and so I was going to fit in great. And he's moving really quickly through these descriptions of the cool kids, but he still gives you details, and I'm going to come back in a minute to some of the details that he uses to help you understand who these kids are and why they're cool. And at first, at the beginning, he's going along enjoying life and thinking he's maybe going to fit in at this new school. And then all of a sudden, the story takes a turn. And sometimes that's how things are going to work out, right? If your story builds up to a conflict, it might have rising action where things seem like they're going okay, and then boom, all of a sudden things change. So he builds this tension by making you feel like, oh, everything's funny, it's cool, everything's going along okay. And then he even tells you he's not sure when it happened, when he, how he suddenly became uncool. And that's a little bit sarcastic, right? You're supposed to understand that probably there were clues all along, but because he's telling you from the point of view of his childhood, he's putting you in this position where you don't see it coming, right? You don't recognize that he's about to be uncool. So the plot unfolds and the action rises. Then, after it takes this turn where he suddenly says, I realized I wasn't cool, he does this cool thing where there's a more focused narrative within the larger story. So things are about to get more specific. He's going to tell you about a particular moment, and he's going to hyper-focus in on that. And that's the moment when he gets egged. And this, so the way that he zooms in on that part of the story tells you it's the climax. This is what all this tension has been building up to. So we now know things are about to turn wrong. And the conflict here is not really between him and the cool kids. The conflict is around the question of whether he's going to succeed at being cool. And so the climax happens when he finds out he's not, and Waleed brings the cool kids to egg him. And what I want you to notice is how the action slows down in the climax so that you can really focus in on it. He wants you to pay attention here because this is where the meaning and the meat of his story are. So before we go on to talk about the conclusion of the story, I wanted to talk about a few things that he does that I think are fascinating just in general. One is that in a story, things generally unfold in chronological order, right? First this happened, then this happened. But sometimes they stretch over a longer period of time, and so the way that he holds the bits of his story together is that he has certain points that he returns to. And one of those points is this joke about the kids sitting under the tree singing Informer. And lots of you guys may be too young to know Informer, but it's a song that was really popular in the early 90s. Because I think Kumail Nanjiani is about the same age that I am. So early to mid 90s. And these kids, the cool kids, sit under the bright green tree at the center of the campus and they sing Informer. Da-da-da-da-da-da. And he sets that up at the beginning and then he's going to keep returning to it. Right? He's going to talk about himself how he wants to sing Informer, and then later he's going to go back and he's going to see Waleed sitting under the tree singing Informer, and he's going to say this is how I knew, right? So it's a theme that he returns to over and over again, and I think that that's really fascinating. Also, he uses dialogue, right? He gives you specific examples of exact things that he says, and most of his dialogue is when he's telling you about the jokes that they would make. So he gives you his example of turning Jay into gay and how when he was, in middle school, he thought that was hilarious, or late high school, however old he is. And then also the exact thing that he yells at the kids when he slows down and he runs away from them while they're egging him, and he slows down and turns around and says, egg backwards is gay. Are you guys gay? And he wants you to see how painfully dumb that is, right? You know that it's a terrible joke. And so he has to give you the exact wording so that you see how humiliating and embarrassing that moment is. So you don't have to use dialogue all the time. Save dialogue for when it's really meaningful in the way that he does here. Other places where he gives you great detail, when he's trying to give you the example of how Waleed suddenly came back one day and was good looking, he says, oh, it's like that, everybody knew that kid who comes back from the summer and he's hot all of a sudden. And he gives you the details of the girls all like him, and those are all good supporting details, but his best description is when he says he looked like he stepped out of the Captain America machine, right? So it tells you he looked like this icon of attractiveness. When he talks about the cool kid tree, he says it was the greenest tree and that it probably was mathematically at the center of the school. So it's not literally at the center of the school. That's a imagery to help you understand these are the kids at the center of everything. They have all the best stuff. They sit in the coolest places. And that's a very relatable idea. So on the one hand, it's specific because he gives you details, but on the other hand, it's very relatable. I also love his thing about Waleed and Maleed. So he says it's like he was, this kid was his friend, and then all of a sudden he was evil. So it's like Mario is the good guy, and then Wario is evil Mario. And so he says it's like there was Maleed, who was the good guy, and then he became Waleed. And I also wanted to point out, just as important as looking at what is described is looking at what isn't described. He doesn't tell you a lot about what he looked like, right? What Kumail himself looked like. And there's a reason for that, and I want you guys to kind of think about why you think that might be. My suggestion is that maybe it's that even though he is telling the story from his point of view, all of his focus is on everybody else, right? He's not paying attention to himself as he is. He's thinking too hard about who he wants to be. And so he doesn't describe himself in the moment, he describes everybody else. The only person you really get a physical description of is Waleed. So physical descriptions of people are not always equivalent to good detail, right? Save your detail for the things that you want the reader to pay attention to. That's when you throw in your detail, because it gets people to pause and look. Don't waste your detail on things that aren't important. And according to him, he's not that important in this story. So think about what he does spend his time describing. And then we come to the conclusion. So McWhorter says the conclusion ends the story and connects to the thesis. So my interpretation of that is the conclusion gives the reader a sense of where the writer or narrator stands now in terms of viewing their subject. And what Nanjiani does is he actually jumps forward in time, and he tells you literally how he feels about the issue now. And what's interesting about narrative is that sometimes the conclusion or the intro of a 5-paragraph essay is where you really drive home your thesis, right? But in a narrative, you might give the reader a sense of where you're going, but your conclusion is where you really tie together the overall meaning of the story or the lesson. You tell the reader what they're supposed to get out of your story. And what Nanjiani wants you to get is this story about he gets the Facebook request from Waleed, and then he reacts to that. And he summarizes how he feels about his past attempts to be cool, and then he does this thing where he provides the moral to the story. So he tells you, like, be yourself, don't try to be cool. But what's funny about that is that it's that's very cliched. If you wrote that in an essay, I would say this is too cliched, right? Everybody knows this is like a standard lesson, is to say, oh, just be yourself, right? He flips that on his head and makes it a little more personalized by, instead of just ending on that, he says, so I deleted that stupid friend request, right? Because screw that guy. So in a way he's learned, but in a way he's still the same guy, where he kind of resents these cool kids and resents how he was treated in that moment. And then really quickly, a couple of other things I want you to think about. I want you to think about who the audience is for his story. Who's he aiming this at? And I'm not going to answer that question for you right now. I just want you to think about it. And I also want you to think about how you reacted to the story and why. So as you're thinking about all of that stuff, take a look at some of the things in the textbook and see how these things connect back to the way that McWhorter talks about narrative.